This video was inspired by a challenge run I saw a few weeks ago posted by someone by the YouTube name of Seer. I was fairly entertained by the premise of his challenge, despite a few more curse words than I would generally like. But there were some obvious bits of his run that I think could have been handled slightly differently by exploiting some of the lesser-known mechanics in Final Fantasy IV. And I thought that would be fun to share. I was also intrigued by the ideal mentioned in the later half of the video of doing this entire challenge with the added restriction of not running from enemy encounters. Some of the encounters in the game can be quite challenging, so I decided that I would try to hold myself as closely to the original rules of the challenge, most namely using the Japanese version of the game translated into English, no running, no magic, and focusing on using the female cast whenever possible. While I believe the original intent was to make the hardest playthrough of Final Fantasy IV possible, I will be exploiting some mechanics and glitches to speed things along, and explaining some of the nuances on how to abuse these mechanics along the way. Apologies in advance, as I'm honestly not great at video editing, and the footage I recorded is butchered because I used way too much speed up, but I hope you enjoy this summary of my playthrough. So already at the start of the game, there's a big divergence. Mist Dragon is completely trivial, but by using one of the early tints we collected, it's possible to perform a glitch known as Misclip. This provides early access to the Tiara and Change Rod, which will be very big power boosts early in the game. And it also removes a lot of the tedium of dealing with a level 1 Rydia with 30 HP. This leads us into the first big battle mechanic I would want to explain, and something that actually caused me to reset my run later because I chose a bad ROM hack to play with. So in Final Fantasy IV, there is a row battle system, and by being in the back row, your defense is doubled and attacks you make and are made against you have halved accuracy. This also applies to monsters too, so attacking from the back row to an enemy in the back row cuts your accuracy to just 1/4. This also applies to monsters though. So Rydia in the early game can get quite a big boost from this and completely avoid the penalty by using the magic missile attack from the rod that she has equipped. And later you can use the Ice Rod's Ice Spell to help mitigate some of this issue. With the increased defense from the Tiara, double defense from being in the back row, and all of the accuracy penalties, she is quite well protected against enemy attacks and usually only takes 1 damage. This allows her to recruit Tella and loot the secret Cure 3 potion behind the waterfall pretty easily. The two potentially bad encounters in the waterway are the toad enemies. Depending on which version you get, they will either counterattack with toad or cast it when they are the last enemy alive. Luckily, you can use the Change Rod to turn them into pigs and completely remove this effect, or this spell. The other dangerous enemies are the tiny mages who cast level 1 spells and counterattack with hold. Status effects, however, have a priority system in Final Fantasy IV, so if you cast Piggy on Rydia, you can avoid the hold status, and the Tiara has enough magic defense to deal with the magic damage. Shortly after getting into the waterway, you'll obtain the Ice Rod, and getting to Octoman is a fairly easy process. You can do this pretty much straight from a new game. Octoman himself starts very fast, but he has a mechanic where every couple attacks he loses an arm and his attack speed is reduced, so he isn't much of a problem. This gets us to the second theoretical power spike in the run, the bows and arrows in Dampian. Originally I told you about how accuracy was affected by Rose, but by equipping a quote-unquote long-range weapon, this accuracy penalty is removed. Now the bow itself is a pretty bad weapon to start with terrible accuracy and power, and a very limited number of arrows. However, there is a bug where the back row bit is never removed when equipment is changed, causing all future attacks to ignore row accuracy. This is a little time for me to rant though, because I originally started playing with a ROM hack called the Naming Way Edition, which passed my US ROM to the original Japanese settings. The hack claimed it was an attempt to bring Final Fantasy IV closer to its Japanese counterpart. There were also a lot of quality of life features, such as faster walking when pressing B and stuff, but unfortunately, what I didn't know until after getting to Fabul is it also removed many bugs from the game, including several that are fundamental to how you play Final Fantasy IV. Essentially, because it decided to fix the back row glitch, now my attack power is cut by a factor of 4 in some circumstances, and is going to eventually lead me to restart this run. Anyways, rant aside, I also have unlimited healing now thanks to the recovery pot in Dampian, and we finally get the first challenge of the run, getting past Antlion Cave, and we have a difficult roadblock ahead of us, the Basilisk. This enemy casts Gradual Petrify after a couple of attacks, and I have a couple game overs due to this. It's possible using items and focusing down the Basilisk to get through, but you have to take a lot of care to deal with them, and it took me several tries before I could figure out how to get through and look through this area. Antlion himself has a counterattack mechanism, but if you use magic attacks, aka using one of your rods, this will bypass the counterattacks, and so there really is no issue beating him. Afterwards, Rosa joins the party, and now it's time for Mount Hobbs. I debated with myself if I should be able to use Prey from Rosa, since you could argue that it's magic even if it doesn't consume magic points. But at this point I decided I didn't want to deal with it to make things a little more restrictive. Either way, I started up Hobbs, and there are several encounters up here that are extremely difficult to deal with. There are cockatrice enemies that use a stone attack when they are the last enemy left alive, and there are gargoyles that will use Tornado after a couple rounds, resulting in death if you can't immediately heal. They also come in the same group, so you have the option of killing the gargoyle only to be stoned by the cockatrice. I could keep Rosa and Rydia alive and spend a lot of healing items to reduce this RNG, but the enemies are starting to pack a little bit of a punch, and my healing items are somewhat low, so I decide that since I don't have a good weapon for Rosa, it's better not to use her. It is possible to use some arrows at this point to take down the troublesome enemies, but your accuracy is pretty low. Both the gargoyle and cockatrice are flying enemies, so they take extra damage from bows and arrows. After a bit of pushing through though, I do manage to get to Mom Bomb and do a trial fight. Rydia can handle the first phase as long as she has some potions to use, but the second phase, despite being able to use an hourglass, is a bit troublesome. I'm not able to kill fast enough, and so the bombs decide to explode and take Rydia out. I was being stubborn, so instead of using multiple hourglasses, I just did a little bit more leveling and also brought in Rosa. And I did manage to win the fight, only to get to the other side and die to the Cockatrice and Gargoyle combo. But after a bit more attempts, I was able to get to the other side. There is an argument to be made that you should grind all the way to level 29 with Rydia right now, as you will need the levels later, and it will greatly improve Rydia's damage from getting 2 more attack multipliers. And so personally, I recommend doing this before doing Hobbs. Eventually, when you do get past Hobbs, there are still Cockatrice and Gargoyles to deal with, but you can save abuse, so it's not too bad. Piggy will take care of the upgraded Needlers, and the monster strength isn't really that bad, but you will be spending healing items to get through the fights around here. Fabul is an Edward solo. As long as you have enough hourglasses, you can easily win this. I chose to use 2 for the first 2 fights with Baron Soldiers, and fought the other monsters normally. In this run, I was running low on potions and was essentially completely out by the time I won this fight. And unfortunately, this is where my first run ends. I did a little more testing to see how bad Porom was going to be, and started grinding item drops. I got bored of grinding them, and so went to use a duplication glitch in the game, but for some reason it wasn't working. I thought this might have been because I used a 1.1 ROM and was debating just buying the potion, since that would be more original to the Japanese ROM, being able to duplicate the items. But when I did get Rydia to level 29, I noticed that she was still missing attacks and that her accuracy was far lower than it should have been. After some more testing and rewatching footage, I noticed several changes and even dug up a Japanese ROM and struggled through the point to confirm that the patches had changed several core gameplay mechanics, and so I ended up switching to a Japanese ROM with a translation patch. I won't bore you with the details, but I ran through everything a second time, this time with duplicated potions after reaching Dampian. I had also solved the Basilisk problem in Antlion, since my accuracy was much higher now, and they have the Reptile Race subclass, which takes 4 times damage from the Ice Rod. Mom Bomb was also pretty easy. Rydia, with her increased damage, easily defeated all the bombs solo with a single hourglass. I did get very unlucky grinding for high potions to duplicate with, and it took me almost until level 30 to get 2 high potions to drop for the duplication, despite having probably 10 drops in my previous run. I do want to touch on this duplication glitch I've been mentioning a little bit. This glitch allows any item that can be used in battle and you have 2 stacks of, which you can get from a monster or chest drop, to be underflowed, so you obtain 255 of that item. This obviously saves a massive amount of grinding when it comes to potions. The problem is you could also use this for hourglasses, and then you have instantly won every enemy encounter until the very end of the game. That being said, if you had enough time, you could just farm imps for the same effect. It would just take a lot longer to do. I decided I would not be duplicating hourglasses. I will very rarely use them for the fights that desperately need them. And most of the other very strong attack items I will not be duplicating. But I did want to mention this, and I will be duplicating potions because it's going to save me the probably 100-hour grind to get hundreds of high potions outside of Kaipo, which doesn't do any of us any favors. Now that I have a lot of potions though, it's time to deal with Porom. I decide to use the NPC in town to cast Piggy on Porom so that I can avoid some nasty status effects later. You could just get a Lamia to land a silence on you and have essentially the same effect though. Right now we have bigger problems though. Porom gets to use the tiara from Rydia, but you only get to use the staff, and I don't have enough arrows to kill all of the enemies with arrows. Without rods for their magical attack damage, there's very little she can do to win fights, usually dealing single-digit damage. So really your only option right now is to abuse saving while walking all the way to Mount Ordeals while winning a couple fights with imps on the way. If someone decided to do this without potion duplication, then it becomes very important to decide what fights you're going to take at what levels so that you gain as much EXP per health point that you lose. Ordeals changes things drastically for Porom. Most of the enemies here take damage from healing items, so I start using high potions to kill some of the stronger enemies, and honestly, this tactic can actually save you potions because of how much damage is required, especially at these low levels. I also pick up Tella, and he comes with the Gaia Robe, which will be extremely important later as it prevents gradual petrify. But for now, it's like one extra defense point for Porom. Level 32 seemed like a nice target to grind for, as this is the highest attack damage Porom will have until level 67. And we're going to be needing that attack damage for later. Ordeals itself isn't very hard. After you get to the mid-20s, there aren't any significant threats. You're just going to be going through a lot of potions and grinding through the tedium. Mylon and the zombies are very simple. You can use an hourglass and kill the stopped zombies very quickly. And since we have the tiara, the bolt counters from Mylon are not a big problem. Mylon Z also takes a lot more damage, I believe 8 times damage from holy arrows, so I use a few of these just for fun and solve the fight quite easily, though you could use high potions instead. Now we get to Baron, and Baron is basically the make or break point of this run. First, we have the fight with 2 guards who will counter with many, and this is quite nasty to deal with. Thankfully, you can just use an hourglass and get rid of them with just a few staff bonks. Yong, on the other hand, has 60,000 HP to work through because he's supposed to be script killed by Cecil after his second kick attack. I restart halfway through my first fight and decide to use a Silk Web on this fight since it reduces the amount of healing I need by a significant amount. Even so, this is a very long and tedious fight. The Baron Waterway has a couple enemies that can use Hold, which again can be countered with Piggy from Isidia. And then we have to deal with the Baron Guards again. These can come with other enemies or in another double battle. But unfortunately, because of the way Mini works, you have to use an hourglass on them or get very lucky when fighting them. Mini, and by extension Toad, reduces both your attack to 1 and your defense to 0, and it doubles enemies' attack power against you. I used probably more resources than I should have, several hourglasses, to get past all of the guards I encountered at this point. but eventually I get to the save point, and after some resets to get past the encounters, I make my way to Baigen. Baigen is a little bit tricky. He has about 4,000 HP, and the back arm casts Vampire, which inflicts sap and honestly does quite a bit of damage. The first arm can cast Entangle, but Piggy will make sure that that's not a problem. It's worthwhile to deal a couple hundred damage to the front arm to prevent the explode when Baigen dies from wiping you out, but otherwise just kill the back arm first and then slowly whittle down Baigen. Just doing both Baigen and Yang drain a lot of potions, and I'm also kind of running low on silk webs because I used a few too many earlier. I know that Keinazo could be a very difficult fight, or is going to be a very difficult fight, and I need to use 2 silk webs to get a low-level kill strategy that I worked up to work. I also decided to use save states to drop a set of poison arrows from the Hydra enemies. This gives Porom the best possible attack power at this point. Unfortunately, Keinazo is still a problem. Once his HP gets low, he can use a healing ability, and after his first heal, he changes his defense values, so for the rest of the fight, he's going to have some evasion multipliers. Long story short is, it's possible with luck and poison arrows and some really silly stuff that I was able to do to kill Keinazo right now. But I decided to reload and go level up to level 42. You might be asking why level 42 would make such a big difference when Porom isn't going to get another attack boost till level 67, and the answer is the active time battle system in FF4. This can get very long and tedious to explain, and really if you want a decent chance of understanding what is happening, you need to run a Lua script to show the battle pointers and the different ATB timers for all the people in the game. The very basics of it, though, is Cecil is set up to always need 5 ATB ticks between actions. Everyone else is scaled off of Cecil's agility, and a level 1 Paladin Cecil with no special equipment is going to have 13 agility. Final Fantasy IV also rounds down whenever possible, so if someone had 14 agility, one more than what Cecil has, they would only need 4 ATB ticks between actions. Without really going into the math, you can take Cecil's agility times 5, in this case 65, and divide it by the agility of whoever you want to know their ATB counter, rounding down. At level 42, Porom will have 22 agility. A little quick math shows that 22 times 3 is 66, so 65 divided by 3 is going to be a number just under 3, which will round down to 2. At lower levels than 42, Porom is going to be about 50% slower than if she was at 22 agility. The next thing to note is that the Hermes Sandal item can reduce your ATB counter by another percentage, upwards of 25%. But in essence, since it will reduce it to a number just under 2, it will round down to 1. This makes Porom as fast as possible. Values of 0 aren't possible, just to clarify. Adding in a Bacchus wine will allow Porom to attack without needing any menuing, speeding things up even further. So, with all of that explanation out of the way, the game plan is to have Porom use a Hermes when the battle starts. She's going to attack Keinazo repeatedly until his wave attacks go down to doing about 35 to 40 damage, since this is based on his current HP. At this point, we're going to use a Silk Web as soon as he casts Haste. Normally, a Silk Web would double the ATB, but since he's already cast Haste on himself, we need to use a second one to make sure he is as slow as possible. We're going to then use a Thor Rage to get him out of his Tsunami phase so that we have more time before he casts Haste again. And with all of this and the best bow and arrow possible equipped, you can use a Bacchus Line, and in theory you will win the battle against Keinazo before he can recover. His next action after using Recover is the Evasion boost, which means if he gets to a second Recover, you will not win this fight. For me, after some testing, Porom was able to win just using Holy Arrows, but I wasn't able to win using the staff. The poison arrows I manipulated earlier weren't needed at all. You could aim for one more possible thing to help win this fight, which if Keinazo already has an action queued up, he will execute that before casting Remedy, which buys you another 2 or 3 attacks. To pull that off, you need to know his HP totals very precisely. And then basically after queuing up the Thor Rage, you can hold the run buttons during the fight to get a consistent pop-up of can't run between every battle tick. Ideally, if you know exactly how many of these you need to wait before he says gathering the water, and then you use the Bacchus Line on the exact right ATB tick, then you will attack right before he casts Tsunami, and then he has to waste extra time with the Tsunami before being able to cast Remedy. This definitely isn't needed, but unfortunately Porom has also lost her ability to crit by this point in the game. You have to love Final Fantasy IV bugs, and so you're not going to be able to luck through with a couple of big crits. We don't really need the Holy Arrows going forward, so no harm in sacrificing them here. Just remember to unequip all the armor on Porom, because both the Tiara and the Gaia Robe are extremely important going forward. With Keinazo defeated, we enter a small section with no female party members. In the original challenge video, it was decided to use Cid as the lowest level in the group. Honestly, Tella would be nearly impossible to defeat the Dark Elf with, since his strength actually decreases until he reaches level 70, giving him possibly the worst damage in the game. So you're not going to hear me complaining about this choice. Cid is somewhat of an oddball with very high strength and HP and not much else. His hammer is miles better than the staff that Porom had access to, and since I saved Kane's iron armor from the start of the game, and I can use a bow for the back row glitch, Ordeals is going to be some very easy EXP. After a short amount of time, Cid reaches level 30 and he can handle most of the enemies on his own. Unfortunately, the next dungeon, Cave Magnus, also has a couple very annoying things we have to take care of. Standard theory applies though, since you can use Silence or Piggy to give some status protection, and then head to the cave. You have to unequip all armor here, but Cid doesn't really need it to be able to beat most enemies in a straight up brawl. Unfortunately, we have the Coral in this cave. This enemy has an instant death attack when it's the only enemy left alive. There are also formations where it is the only enemy type, so you just have to be lucky that you are able to kill it on your next attack, or you have a chance of just dying. Luckily, it's not a super common encounter, and so you can luck your way through the cave. Ogres are also pretty hard-hitting, but Cid can take care of them. I got kind of lucky and dropped a strength ring at this point. This does a lot to boost your attack later, so that was very lucky, and I decided to use my one exit item to leave and save the game before I got a game over. After a few wipes, I managed to make it to Dark Elf. His magic attacks aren't really a big problem, and Piggy doesn't do anything detrimental to me. His dragon form can be stopped with an hourglass, and this is fairly important to do since the dragon breath deals percentage HP damage. You could also exploit his holy weakness with holy arrows if you really wanted, but when I was doing the math, since we don't have any good bows at this point, it doesn't really do that much to help. Za isn't too bad, though I'm glad I didn't have to grind all those healing potions that I had to use. The Earth Hammer, when you get it, wrecks everything in here, and the Trap Chest also has an armor upgrade for Cid if you need it. Do watch out for the elemental weakness it gives, but there aren't really many enemies that can exploit that here. You can optionally farm illusions and the rune staff and rune ring from the summoner and his dolls in this tower, and it gives a decent amount of EXP as well. The illusions make the Valvalis fight much easier, but I don't really exploit this too much, just getting a couple in before I want to push into the fight. The Mega Cisterns aren't really a problem, and a Bacchus Vine from Cid takes care of them quickly. Valvalis is a problem though. My Rosa comes in at mid-50s, which is fine as far as agility goes. The Gaia Robe really helps this fight a lot, though in theory, if you had enough illusions and Go Needles, you could probably get away with it. If you want to extend this, it should be possible with the right setup to throw a Silk Web before Valvalis uses her spin. But that's going to require a lot of manipulation and probably extra party members alive at the start of the fight, which borderline breaks the challenge rules. Regardless, there is one more item to consider. Valvalis has evasion multipliers while spinning, which greatly reduces damage, especially from mages that have low attack multipliers and low accuracy bows. Luckily, Rosa has the aim command, which sets her accuracy to 255 and ignores evasion multipliers. There is a sort of bug/overflow when she is in the middle slot, but from any other position, she can still deal decent damage to Valvalis. With the battle speed set to 6, to allow for extra menuing time, it's just possible to heal between tornadoes and getting attacks off. Unfortunately, aim is also a little bit slower than a normal attack, so even after using a Hermes, I have to alternate attacking and healing rounds after I use my 3 illusion dolls. On my first attempt, I almost win the fight, but I accidentally miss input and die. This is a long and tedious fight, but on the second attempt, I eventually get the win. After this point, there isn't much reason not to go ahead into the underground as long as you have an okay stock of healing. The drops in the underground are much less friendly to grind, but we will be back above ground before too long and with Rydia. That said, I recommend getting the rune staff with Cid before switching over to Rosa because it helps a lot with the underground, and it's a good alternative to arrows for the Valvalis fight if you need to. In Dwarf Castle, you can kill all of the dolls except one of each type, and then use an hourglass to freeze the back doll and thus avoid the merged Calcobrana. In theory, you could also farm a headband to get past the charm attack that Calcabrina uses. Golbez requires Cecil to be alive, so you use a life potion to bring him up, and then Rydia will rejoin. You can then life and heal Rosa for safety, and then just beat up Golbez. There are a couple interesting loots in Dwarf Castle, with a potentially big one being the Dwarf Axe for manipulating Cecil's agility. But otherwise, it's time to head off to Babel. There are more Basilisk type enemies, which now counterattack with Petrify, but you can use the Gaia Robe or the Ice Rod to make short work of them. Rydia doesn't have a lot of weapon alternatives, but you can either use the Whip to get paralyzes or the Mithril Knife for slightly better damage. The tower itself has several annoying enemies, as well as another chance to pick up the Rune Staff and Rune Rings. And I get a little bit lucky and manage to get the Rune Staff drop on the first floor of the tower. This makes Rosa my primary damage dealer, and I start up the tower. A lot of enemies here deal percentage-based HP damage, and the worst are the Flan enemies, which I can't damage physically. They seem to have about 400 HP in this version of the game, and I'm just barely able to defeat them using ice spells from the Ice Rod. Lugay can be a bit annoying as well, and I died to him on my first attempt because he explodes Rosa and Rydia dies to the second fight. On my next attempt, I equip lightning arrows on Rosa and use Bacchus Wines for both fights, which deals more than enough damage since Lugay is considered a machine in his second phase. After leaving the tower, we are back above ground, and this is the last chance to easily stock up on Cure 2s and Life Potions, as well as Hourglasses. We will also soon lose access to Bacchus Wines until after Evil Wall is killed. Cave Eblon doesn't have too much of note, though Upper Babel has more coral type enemies. Using Piggy from the Change Rod deals with them just fine, though, and Piggy on Rosa and Rydia deals with the Lamias, who can cast Confuse. In theory, you could also get headband drops from ogres before dealing with them, which would also help your damage number slightly. Ruby is actually tougher than I thought, though, and my levels are a little on the low side compared to what Seer had in his challenge run, so I don't really have enough HP for surviving multiple attacks from Rubicant. I am still able to just berserk with ice arrows and win, though it does cost me a Cure 3 potion and an elixir, since I got somewhat poor luck when he was killing off my other party members. Let me point out again, though, after going past Ruby, you will lose access to a lot of stuff for a pretty challenging portion of the game. I went ahead and went in underprepared, so I had some trouble going forward. My first goal was the Samurai Bow in the Feymarch, and it was just barely possible to make the trip. The enemy encounters are quite strong, and some of them are basically a wipe if you get back attacked. I also made a rather poor choice to fight both Ashura and Leviathan right now, despite there being no reason to fight them. Ashura dies fairly quickly with just some new arrows and a Bacchus Vine, but Leviathan is actually quite tanky, and I ended up wasting another Bacchus and a elixir to beat him. I also took a peek at Sylph Cave, and I had intended to completely clear it out, but the Malboros completely wrecked me, and the enemies are consistently stronger than the Feymarch. That brings us to the Sylph Cave and the trapdoors. The good news is at Battle Speed 6, it is easy to attack and use life potions to keep the party up. The bad news is I only had 6 life potions and I was down to a handful of high potions. It's possible to get both of these in the underground, and you technically have infinite healing at the pot in Dwarf Castle, but this is not a fun process. I spent half an hour trying to get a high potion to drop so I could duplicate it, and then I found a summoner in the Fey March who summons moths over and over, which can drop life potions. I killed a few dozen of those, and when I ended the fight, I got a life potion that I was able to dupe. I also got a second rune staff, which I tossed because I couldn't use it. This does mean at this point in the game, I decided that life potions were fair game for duplicating. With this, I was able to push all the way down to Evil Wall. This fight is basically a time limit, and with a Dwarf Axe or Blood Sword equipped on Cecil, I had as much speed as possible. I did only have 1 Bacchus line, and 2 would have really helped in this fight. I was thinking I would do more damage, and it wouldn't be a problem, but Rosa was doing a little bit less than 2,000 per hit, and even with the mute arrows and the samurai bow equipped. If Rydia had contributed meaningfully, then this would have been over. But I had wasted my extra Bacchus lines on the Fey March bosses. So I went into this fight several times, and every single time he used Crush on Rosa first. After about 5 attempts, he finally hit Rydia first with Crush, and I was able to kill him in the next couple of attacks. This shows how close my damage range was, but I was just a little short from being able to easily win this fight. If this had ended up being a true roadblock, there is one more solution that is quite a pain. The Toad Ladies in Sylph Cave have a very small chance to drop a ribbon, and ribbons negate both the Trapdoors attacks and Evil Wall's Crush attack. Unfortunately, this is a extremely slow grind, and you might consider doing it using save states, but I would not recommend farming for it. With this, we finally have access to all locations minus the final 2 dungeons. I went ahead and duplicated some Bacchus lines just in case I needed them, but I was only planning on using them on bosses at this point in time. I went to the moon and tried a couple of encounters, and they are somewhat possible. The majority are not, though. I did have one last trick that I wanted to try, and so I went back to Sylph Cave again. This time I had equipped the Bard Tunic that I took off of Edward all that time ago. Because the Malboro's attacks deal multiple status elements, if you resist any of the status elements, none of them will land on you. Since silence is one of the effects, you can equip the Bard Tunic and avoid all of the status effects. Rune Rings are the preferred solution, but I didn't get lucky enough for one of those to drop. I believe Ruby Rings from the early game should also work, as they prevent Piggy, but I had already tossed those away. Anyway, with this status immunity, I was able to retrieve the Charm Rod from the cave, and unfortunately, I made a huge blunder at this point in time. I got into a somewhat difficult enemy encounter, which I didn't have any hourglasses to take care of, and I tried casting Charm, which only ended up with the enemies getting berserked, and before I could salvage it, Rosa went down. I looked through my inventory, and the only thing I had that might be able to save it was an elixir, so I went ahead and used it and cast more charms, and then I tried to get Rosa back up and ended up using another elixir. I did manage to win the fight, but using 2 elixirs was honestly way too much for this fight, and I should have just reset, but I wasn't aware at this time how much I was going to need those. not having access to exit was quite a pain at this point. Anyway, with the Charm Rod, I was able to go back to the moon, and I'm technically able to defeat enough enemies that I can get to Fusoya and progress the plot if I do enough save abusing. I can technically grind in Cave Bahamut for rare drops, but there are still some encounters I don't handle very well, and it would eat through my supplies very quickly. Any encounters with Flans are an instant reset. They have thousands of hit points, and I'm not going to sit there trying to do that with the Ice Rod. There is a big caution sign here, though, because once you get Fusoya, you cannot go back to the Earth and grind anymore until after you beat the Giant. The Giant forced me to make another big decision. In theory, I could maybe make it through some of the fights and without spamming hourglasses. But essentially, most of these fights are very neck and neck with my current party members, and I can't really charm or piggy anything here. In theory, you could grind for heroin robes or arty arrows or the extremely rare arty bow, but those are kind of out of the question. It's also somewhat more possible to grind out lit arrows, which would have been a bit more feasible, but at higher levels, it might be possible to just brute force your way here with healing, but overall it's not really a good solution. You could go one step further and use step manipulation to set up the exact set of encounters you want, but that's a little bit outside the scope of this video. Ultimately, I decided at this point that Bacchus Vines were fair game for duplication. I could, in theory, easily grind up a ton of them, and they aren't quite as overpowered as hourglasses are. Without duplication, you need hourglasses, or the healing is just way too much to keep up with. We also have to consider that the final dungeon is coming up soon. You would also probably be a high level 80 by this point if you did all that grinding, which could change the math quite a bit. With Prey, this would be a bit more feasible and might be enough to get the job done. I'm not really sure. I do take an unfortunate reset in my first trip through the Giant with Bacchus Vines because I encounter a Dragon Machine. Because of their percentage-based HP damage, it's just not possible to win that fight without hourglasses, or at least the Artemis arrows. Ignoring that, it's time for the Four Fiends fight, and my setup is pretty simple. Most of the Four Fiends resist arrows, and you can target specific elemental weaknesses that would override that for one enemy in particular, but I decided to just use the Moonveil I attained along with a Bacchus Vine and the Rune Staff to do decent enough damage. Ruby is a mage in this fight, so the Rune Staff will take him down quite easily. The Moonveil might be a little bit overkill, but it gives you physical attack immunity for the rest of the fight, and it gives you reflect status. I do die on the first attempt because I got cursed by Mylon, and with half attack power I couldn't finish off the fight fast enough. But in the second fight I have Rydia stay alive long enough just to cure the curse, and then Rosa finishes the fight without problem. Next, however, is CPU, and while it's not exactly hard, it does cost a lot of healing. Obviously, you take out the defender first, but I haven't restocked on my potions in a while, and I start to get down to the single-digit numbers before the end of the fight. All of these percentage-based HP attacks are just really annoying to deal with. I decided to make a last-ditch effort play using another elixir on Rosa and a Bacchus line for when I get down to my last 1,000 hit points. This is just enough to secure the win, and with that I can move on to the moon. I will mention there is a trap chest in the giant that drops an elixir. I decided to skip this. In theory, you could use this elixir to duplicate elixirs and make the rest of the game pretty trivial, but I decided I did not want to do this. With all of that decided, it's time for the final dungeon. With the Charm Rod, I can take care of the Warlock formation since they start casting stone on themselves. With Bacchus Wine spam, I can just barely win most of the other encounters. But stuff like double red giants is quite nasty to deal with. If you had plenty of charm arrows for giant effectiveness, you could make do, but those are extremely rare drops as well. I consider Bacchus Wines the most fair way to approach this dungeon without forcing me to grind. I do get Artemis arrow drops pretty early, which improves my damage a lot, but they can also be looted before any real dragon fights. The Flame Whip for Rydia is a nice pickup, but not really useful since she's on healing duty. I do die once to a fight with gold Ryus because Rosa only sometimes one-shots them with Berserk, but I get paralyzed from the counterattack and she doesn't recover fast enough due to the percentage-based lightning attacks they do. Piggy is unfortunately not an option at this point because it prevents the Berserk status. I also get a Protect Ring halfway down the Lunar Subterrane, giving resistance to all elements, and it's pretty high defense rating. By putting that in the Tiara on Rosa, which has dragon resistance, she is able to become close to unkillable. I do make one more giant misplay by trying to get the Heroine robe before going to the save point at the bottom. And Rosa kills the Warlock early, and so the carries use their Embrace attack to kill my team with stone. The next time down, I go to save and I get the ribbons first. I decided to go with a fun strategy called Lunar Frogs. You can reflect the breath attack of the Lunar Dragons, and if you're lucky, both of them will turn into frogs. Otherwise, you can just attack the frog first, and they will start casting virus on each other. The only important thing to note at this point is to kill the non-frog dragon first, as if it's alive after the other one dies, it will start doing percentage-based fire attacks. Other than that, this fight is completely trivial. And I use the last of my holy arrows to speed up the fight. I then go back and get the Heroine robe, and Rydia now has the ribbon equipped to prevent any misfortune. The Heroine robe also prevents the paralyzed status, so Rosa is now basically unkillable to regular enemies. I decide to give Zeromus a try and encounter the single difficult fight remaining, and that is the Evil Mask. The reflective spells Evil Mask use deal a lot of damage, and even with Berserk and Artemis arrows, you get quite a bit of damage. They are robots though, so lightning arrows can take them down fairly quickly. I also fight one of the Zemus Breath enemies, and it's just a really slow fight. I decided to use Piggy to protect against the Zemus Mines enemy's charms, and thus I wasn't able to Berserk for this fight, and it took a while to whittle down its HP. Then we get to Zeromus, and unfortunately I only have 2 elixirs, and my damage is not really quite where I need it to be to go for a quick kill. I do a little bit of looking through some online resources and find out that there is one more elixir in the Lunar Subterrane I can grab. but that's it. There are no more that I can access. I do get a decent way through the fight, getting Zeromus almost to his second phase, but I'm going to need a better setup and more consumables to win this fight. I go ahead and loot everything in the subterrane, beginning with a cheese strat against Plague by letting Rosa punch him to death using a Bacchus Wine. Basically, you can make it so that she never dies to the death counter. On the way, I get another defense ring for Rydia and fight Wyvern. Rosa can survive the opening Mega Nuke, and shortly after that, Wyvern is dead. I also pick up the Stardust Rod and another Cure 3 potion and the Elixir, as well as defeating Peldium on the way out. With the Stardust Rod, I can now beat up the Flan enemies, so leaving isn't really a problem. Just for fun, I go and kill Bahamut using 2 Bacchus Wines and just tanking the Mega Nuke. And on my way out, I managed to get a Moonveil to drop, which was very nice. I then quickly kill Odin on Earth to complete all of my murder of the summoned bosses. And I briefly thought about trying to farm out an Artemis bow, which I could have duplicated for Rydia and Rosa to use. And then I found out that it's one of the rarest drop rates and decided that I was not going to do that. There are a handful of other items you can get, but I decided that I could just use Bacchus Wines and go to the Lunar Core to farm experience points and raise my HP totals. I was grinding and almost got Rosa to level 80 when I found out that 2 Evil Masks can spawn in a single fight, and because I had let Rydia die earlier in my grinding to level up Rosa faster, I take yet another wipe. And so I get a little more careful with my grinding, and I managed to get into the mid-70s before going back to Zeromus again. I do encounter Zemus Mind this time, and again use Piggy to prevent Charm, though if you had gotten headband drops from Behemoth or Ogre, that would be a little bit better. Essentially all I have to do is spam my attack items and the Stardust Rod to very slowly kill it though. My first attempt against Zeromus at this higher level goes alright, but it's not great either. I managed to transition into the second phase of the fight, but I'm not able to keep Rydia healed up, and she goes down to a nuke. I don't have enough recovery items to push through the rest of the fight, and so I try to let Rosa get through the last bit by herself, but my damage just isn't high enough. I go in one more time, but I decided to pull out all of the stops to win this time. I had been using Rydia to kill Cecil, and that delayed my early setup quite a bit. This time I decided that Rosa and Rydia would use a Moonveil and ignore Cecil, and then I would have Rosa use a Bacchus Wine while Rydia used a Silk Web, causing a nuke counter which reduces Zeromus' Big Bang damage and gets reflected, so I get an extra 2,000 damage to Zeromus. Cecil dies to the Big Bang and Rydia heals up the minor amount of damage. I time another very precise spell cast from the Stardust Rod using the Berserk status of Rosa to buffer the input, and get another nuke counter nerfing the second Big Bang. I heal up again and I push into phase 2 before the virus attack comes out, which saves me quite a bit of health. After this, I just need to Berserk Rosa an extra time and heal up the nuke damage with my elixirs, and Zeromus dies shortly after with an elixir to spare. Overall, this was an interesting challenge. I liked the dynamic that no running gave to some of the enemy groups, but honestly, I did have to abuse a lot of mechanics to make it a reasonable challenge that I could grind out in a weekend. This at least proves it's theoretically possible if someone wanted to grind out the potions without duplication, but I really don't see that much value in spending hours and hours farming hourglasses and Cure 2 potions. You can remove a lot of the healing tedium by using Pray with Rosa, but frankly at the end of the day, I felt like this was a nice compromise. I mostly wanted to play this challenge and make this video to showcase some of the obscure bits of game knowledge from speedrunners and randomized players that's largely unknown to the majority of people who play Final Fantasy IV. I highly recommend the randomizer community to anyone who wants to dig deeper into the game. A lot of people have put a lot of effort into cataloging the exact methods by which the game works. Back to the original creator's intent, this run would be far more challenging and perhaps impossible if played on the USA 1.1 ROM. Without J items, many of the fights are much harder, and even with the slightly reduced enemy stats, it's just so much more difficult without Bacchus wines and hourglasses. Duplication is also not possible on the 1.1 ROM, meaning grinding is the only option. And you also lose access to J abilities, including the Pray command, but interestingly, they decided to keep aim. Potions are more likely to drop because of all of the items being removed from the drop tables, but it would still be quite a bit harder. Using the 1.0 USA ROM would allow item duplication, and that would remove some of the tedium from the run while keeping the higher difficulty, though the option of late game elixir spam would remove any sense of urgency in the late game. Anyway, I've been rambling on long enough now. I hope everyone enjoyed this challenge of Final Fantasy IV, and hopefully you were able to learn something. Have a nice day.